Welcome to Off Hours, a conversation between John Edwards and Chris Manning.
We have a little bit of follow-up from last week's episode. During that show, I was talking a little bit about dark mode in apps on the iPhone X, and I mentioned Tweetbot having been updated to have a black dark mode, and I was wrong. It was not Tweetbot that I was thinking about. It was actually Overcast that I was thinking about. One of the nice things that Marco did with Overcast shortly after the iPhone X was released was he included his normal light mode and dark mode, which has a gray background, and it also now has a black mode in there. And I would like to say that Overcast is the podcast app that I use. And recently, Marco Arment's released a new tool for podcasters called Forecast, which we've just started using. And that's to make it easier for us to generate chapter markers and add show notes and things like that, image art for the episode. So it's a little bit inside baseball, but if you happen to be into making podcasts, you should go and check out Marco's Forecast application. It is free to use. And if you're not into making podcasts, but you're into listening to them, I'd highly recommend checking out Overcast for listening to them.
Mm-hmm. I definitely second that. I also have a bit of follow-up in terms of erroneous information. My recollection of @_inside's little video demo of his vision for Control Center was a false memory. What I described was entirely fabricated. That was my own desire for what I would like to see. That was, in effect, inspired to some extent by what he had done. So I don't know how that transpired as it did, but my mind completely made up what I was describing. But I would still very much like to see Control Center just integrated into the multitasking switcher off to the right-hand side there. And then another bit of follow-up too, going back to our episode on the watchmaking schools. Since we recorded that, I've chatted with a representative from Rolex and discovered from them they are starting to roll out training programs at all of their after-sales service centers around the world. So if you happen to have an official Rolex service center that's being run by Rolex near where you live, and if you're interested in pursuing this as a career, I would touch base with them and see if they are already offering that or if they're about to offer that. And what it is actually a paid apprenticeship. So you would actually be paid to learn the craft rather than having to shell out some money or go for free if you happen to go to one of the free schools. So it's definitely a leg up that way. And the training you would get from Rolex is world class.
I like to hear that that's a paid internship. There's so many companies and so many industries where unpaid internships are the norm, and you have to have some money to be able to do an unpaid internship. You have to be in a pretty privileged position to be able to take an unpaid internship.
So last episode, you teased a little something that you enjoy using around the shop, and that we would maybe dive into some other things that we each find handy.
So I think we decided we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the critical things or the essential things that we have with us in our shop on a daily basis, the things we couldn't live without. And the thing I spoke about last episode was my Bose QC35 headphones. They're my noise-canceling headphones, and I love using those for cutting out the background noise of what's going on in the shop. They allow me to focus on what it is that I'm doing because I'm not fighting with the repetitive noises from an air compressor or a lathe or a mill or whatever it happens to be that's running. They're an essential part of what I use to keep my sanity in the shop. My Bose QC35's absolutely essential for what I'm doing. If you're out there looking for noise-canceling headphones, don't look anywhere else. There are other companies that make noise-canceling headphones, and they all pale in comparison to what the Bose ones do.
In a similar vein, something I started keeping around my bench in the last year is just a little Bluetooth remote for playback. Because it's nice to have physical buttons I don't actually have to look at that are permanently affixed to my bench, where I can just skip ahead or pause or play audio or turn the volume up and down. And what I use is just a really inexpensive little Bluetooth remote It's called the iMars. I think I paid $10 or $14 for it. It's been great. It runs on a little lithium cell and has a 2-year battery life. The only caveat I would say that I have with it is because it is running on such a low power source, it's very aggressive in conserving the energy that it does have at its disposal. So the first time I press a button, it's sort of to wake it, and then you have to press it a second time. It kicks in from there. But once you know that, if you're just playing to skip, I'm usually hitting it a few times to skip forward, or if I want the volume up or down, I'm usually hitting it a few times anyway. So I just tack on one extra press. And I can do that without taking my attention away from what I'm working on. Continue to work with one hand while tapping it with another. Just a nice upside from having to look at a screen, or even just if you were to say do playback adjustments from an Apple Watch or something like that. It still would require using both limbs to achieve that. So I appreciate just having those tangible physical buttons right there at my disposal for that. It's been really handy.
Is this something that you tie into your iPhone? You can control your iPhone from that as well?
Yeah, so I have like a whole cloud of Bluetooth action going on in the shop. When I'm working on watches, I'm using the visual spatial part of my brain, so I can listen to audiobooks and podcasts, which is the bulk of what I will listen to, and occasionally I'll listen to some music, but for the most part I'm doing all my playback through an Amazon Echo, which I can also control with my voice, which is even better than using the physical controls. But I found asking Alexa to skip over and over and over again was getting tedious sometimes, trying to
Tiresome. All right.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what actually pushed me over the edge to get the iMars. It is just a quick 30-second skip forward in a podcast, or skipping to the next chapter of a book, or just asking to play or pause. I'll often just use the Alexa, because then I don't even have to take my hands away from what I'm doing. So I play to the Echo from my phone, and then I have the Bluetooth remote there at my disposal as well. And then occasionally, if I'm going to be up and about and going from room to room, I will switch over to one of the Bluetooth earbuds. And the transition between the Echo and the earbuds is actually really seamless. Once I turn an earbud on, the audio immediately transfers over. And once I turn it back off, as long as I'm within range of the Echo, my phone will generally revert back to playing over the Echo. I'm really impressed with how well all these devices work together, given how unpredictable Bluetooth has been for me in the past. Feels like we're over a bit of a hump there. I mean, it's not flawless.
I found the most recent generation of Bluetooth, 4.1, seems to be pretty stable, and I've had relatively few problems with it. I do the same kind of thing where I'm going between my Apple AirPods, my CarPlay, and my QC35s. So all three are Bluetooth devices, depending on what it is that I need. If I'm wandering around Home Depot or, the grocery store, I'm not going to wear my QC35s when I'm doing that. So I use my AirPods when I'm doing that. And then when I get into the car, it just automatically picks up playing with CarPlay. And then when the car shuts off, I can go back to the AirPods quite easily. So I find the current generation of Bluetooth is very stable.
Mm-hmm. How about for actual tools in the shop? What's a must-have on your list?
So you and I do very different kinds of work in the shop a lot of days, and one of the ways that my work differs a great deal from yours is the potential danger to my feet when it comes to heavy things in the shop. I expect that the heaviest thing in your shop that's likely to fall over is not very heavy, whereas I'm often carrying, let's say a chuck for my lathe that weighs 40 or 50 pounds. So for me, a pair of safety boots is absolutely critical. And because I'm often standing in front of a machine for long periods of time, or moving around quite a bit, carrying heavy things, having a comfortable pair of boots is critical. A few years ago, I started using the Magnum Stealth Force boots. They're actually designed as sort of a tactical boot, but they are incredibly comfortable. They've got a memory foam insert in them. They have good ankle support, and most importantly, they have a composite toe and a composite shank through the foot. Now, a lot of people will think about using steel-toed boots or whatever in a safety context, but steel is not actually a good thing to put in a boot for a number of reasons. The first being, if you're dealing with hot things, like I often am, if you pour hot metal onto steel, it will transfer the heat into your foot, which isn't great. And then the other problem with steel is that when it collapses because it's been crushed, it will pinch and stay in place, which means that your foot is now trapped inside of that pinched steel. Whereas with composite, if it does crush, it will crack, and you can actually get your foot out of the boot afterwards without needing to cut out that steel toe. So unless there's some specific reason why you need steel-toed boots, I always recommend composite over steel. They're lighter, they're more comfortable, and they're much safer in a lot of cases. These Magnum boots are amazing. They do make more of a workman type boot as well, but I found that their black tactical boots are actually a lot more comfortable. They zipper down the side so you can get in and out of them easily. They still lace up, but you can get in and out of them easily because of the zipper down the side. So as a watchmaker, I imagine one of the critical tools for you is going to be tweezers. You probably have a number of tweezers that you use, and you probably have some favorites. What do you like in the tweezer department?
Yeah, so I do have a good number of tweezers at my disposal, a number of specialty tips and whatnot. But my two go-to tweezers, the staple ones that I use the most throughout my day in the shop, would be a pair of nickel Dumont tweezers, the number 12s. I use those for finer work, such as picking up escape wheels and things like that, manipulating small parts. And then my second most used pair of tweezers would be a pair of bronze Asco brand tweezers, and I'll use those for handling bridges and barrels and larger parts like that. So those are my staples.
Do you primarily go back and forth between those two, or do you find that there are other tweezers that you have on top of that are maybe more specialty things that you don't use very often that maybe you do need sort of often enough that they're important?
Yeah, so I would say those two tweezers make up probably between 60 and 80% of the operations that I would perform with a pair of tweezers. I also have a pair of boxwood tweezers that I find quite handy. I have some tweezers with carbon fiber tips that I have shaped specifically for handling barrels for certain operations while I'm assembling them. Of course, very fine tweezers for hairspring work and that sort of thing. I've got tweezers for pinching spring clips out of place. I've got some brass tweezers that I use as well for different operations. Occasionally, there will be something that warrants using a pair of steel tweezers, so I do have some fine, not as fine as my number 5s, which I use for hairsprings, but some fine steel tweezers that I'll use for that. I've got tweezers for dirty work. I've got tweezers with ceramic tips that I'll use in conjunction with a laser when I'm heating something up. I mean, I could probably spend the whole episode just talking about tweezers. But my two go-tos are the nickel ones with the finer tips, and then the bronze ones. And I prefer the bronze over brass just because I find compared to most brass tweezers I've handled, they just hold their springiness better over time and offer the same forgiveness that a pair of brass tweezers offers. So both metals are soft. They won't scratch platings the way that a pair of steel tweezers would, and that softness also translates into better grip on parts like springs and that sort of thing. So, and that's also why I favor the nickel tweezers for my fine work over using steel.
Now, the other thing that I spend a lot of time with in my shop is measuring. Everything that I do requires some type of measurement, and there's 3 different scales that I tend to work on the most, and I have a different measuring device depending on which scale it is that I'm working. So the first is the largest scale that I tend to work at, and for that I have a 6-inch or 150 millimeter steel ruler from Starrett that I love. This has very clear graduations on it, and it's very nice to work on. It's got a bit of a satin finish to it, so it doesn't reflect light as much as maybe a lot of steel rulers would. It's small enough to put in my pocket of my apron, and it's sort of the first thing that I go to when it comes to measuring something in terms of scale. The next thing that I use, and this is probably the one that I use the most of anything, is a set of digital calipers. And a lot of people are familiar with digital calipers. There are cheap digital calipers on the market now. If you're in Canada, somewhere like Busy Bee or Princess Auto have cheap digital calipers. You can even walk into a lot of home hardware stores or like a Home Depot or a Lowe's or something like that, and find a cheap pair of digital calipers for, $10 or $15. They claim to measure down to a thousandth of an inch, but any of those cheap calipers are going to be unable to actually resolve accurately at those, at the scale that they tell you that they're resolving at. So just because the display tells you that it's measuring down to a thousandth of an inch, it's not really doing that. I highly recommend getting a quality pair of digital calipers. You're going to spend a little bit more money. In my case, I definitely prefer the Mitutoyo 6-inch / 150 millimeter digital calipers. That tends to be a good size for most of the things that I'm working on in the shop. They are excellent to work with. They are actually accurate to a thousandth of an inch. They will resolve properly to a thousandth of an inch. And it sounds silly, but one of the things that's probably most important with them is they don't chew through batteries quickly. One of the problems with a lot of the cheap digital calipers is that no matter whether you turn them on or off or not, when you're finished with them, they chew through your batteries at a crazy rate. These Mitutoyo digital calipers, they're using the same CR44 button cells that a lot of calipers are using, but I can go for a year on one of those little buttons versus, maybe a week or two in a cheap pair of calipers. So it sounds silly, but you actually save a lot of money over time just because you're using these better quality calipers, and they don't go through batteries as quickly. Don't cheap out on a pair of digital calipers. It's worth owning a good quality set, and the Mitutoyo ones are the best ones I've come across. You'll probably spend about $100 on a pair of them, but it is $100 worthwhile spending. And if you're doing any machining, you will be using them constantly.
Yeah, I've got almost as many measuring devices as I have tweezers. I do see some value in keeping some of the cheap ones around for rough work where you don't need the high resolution. So I keep a pair around for measuring crystals and things like that, because a sapphire crystal and quartz crystals and whatnot, they can mess up a nice pair of calipers. So, and I don't need to resolve that down beyond a tenth of a millimeter when I'm working with those. Different tools for different jobs. But yeah, I 100% agree with you that it's worthwhile investing in a good quality pair, or because you're simply not going to get the accuracy out of a cheap pair from a local hardware store.
Yeah, I find what I do is I eventually rotate my calipers out, so as they get banged up and dropped and chewed up and whatnot, they sort of get migrated to less and less critical places. So the pair that sits on my desk in front of my computer where I'm doing CAD work and things like that, that's the sort of the oldest pair that's been beat up the most, and they've been dropped a number of times and whatnot. So I tend to sort of migrate them, but they're definitely worth having. I can't stress this enough when I talk to people. People think that it's worth cheaping out on this, but it's a tool that's so critical and you use so often. It's definitely worth getting a good pair, and treat them well. Don't do what I do. Don't throw them around and drop them.
One other thing or point I'd add on that, just in terms of the variety out there, I find value for really fine work in having the old school analog display, because even though the dial might only have gradations for 100th of a millimeter, you can actually say you're working on a very small balance staff or that sort of thing. You can watch that distance between the 100th of a mil mark be taken up over time as you're slowly burnishing down that surface.
I do agree with that. Yeah, the analog calipers are definitely have that advantage. You can read between the sort of the marks on the caliper and do that.
Read between the lines, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. Read between the lines. I find that I make too many mistakes when I'm reading analog calipers. So for me, the digital ones tend to be where I go to. And because of that, I then have the next sort of measuring device that I rely on and that's a digital micrometer. And so when I need to resolve better than a thousandth of an inch, then I tend to go to my digital micrometer, and that will read down to a tenth of a thousandth of an inch. So it's that much more accurate than the digital caliper. The micrometers tend to have a smaller range, so the one I use goes from 0 to 1 inch. You can get them in different sizes, so from 1 inch to 2 inches, and so on and so on, up to, I think the largest I've ever seen was a 16-inch mic, which gets a little ridiculous.
That's huge.
It's massive, yeah. But they tend to only have a 1 inch range that they work in, or 25 millimeter range. And so when I start doing more and more accurate work, then I tend to go down to working with these digital micrometers, because again, I find the digital part works, it's easier for me to work with. And I make fewer mistakes when I'm working with a digital display. But these are, again, an order of magnitude more accurate than the calipers are. And that makes a big difference. I will say, if you're buying a mic, whether it's an analog one or a digital one, don't store them with the carbide faces right up against each other tight. The carbide is very brittle, and temperature changes can force it to expand and crack. So if you've invested in a good mic, then I recommend that you store them with the jaws open, with the anvils separated apart from each other.
I've made a habit of doing the same with my calipers as well when I put them back in the box. So what brand of digital micrometer are you using?
Again, I'm a fan of the Mitutoyos. If you're looking at them and you're looking at Starretts as well, they're also good quality. But I tend to find the Mitutoyos are nicer to work with. I find them more consistent and just more reliable. So I'm a big fan of the Mitutoyo gear for doing any sort of measuring. I have a few dial indicators and test indicators and things like that from Starrett and from Mitutoyo, but I tend to prefer the Mitutoyo ones over the Starrett ones.
So another must-have for me, I really don't enjoy working with mainsprings. So having good mainspring tools makes all the difference. A lot of service centers just dispose of old mainsprings, so it don't really call for tools like that. And in some cases, there are models where you will not even open the barrel or service the barrel at all. The barrel is considered a disposable item. For instance, Rolex's new 3235, 3255 calibers have non-serviceable barrels that are not to be opened, so that you don't have to worry about extracting a mainspring or putting a mainspring into them. You just replace the whole barrel. Breitling's operated that way for a long time with a number of their calibers, and I can name a handful of brands. But if you're working on any sort of vintage pieces and even some modern pieces, handling the barrel and the mainspring respectably is important to getting good end results. So just pulling a mainspring straight out of a barrel, you often end up with deformations. Taking out slowly, you'll end up carving metal off of the rim of the barrel. So I have a tool that is kind of hard to come by now. It's called the ZF2000. It was developed by a Polish watchmaker named Zbigniew Filipowicz. He runs International Swiss Watch Laboratories down in Florida, and as the name implies, he developed it around the turn of the millennium. It's actually two tools, technically. There's the winder and then the extractor, but the extractor is what I find to be really valuable. And it has a series of cutouts that are sized for different barrels. You drop the barrel into it with the cover open, spin it around so that it's centered inside of a small chamber. So there's a hole in the center where you can pull the mainspring up in the same way that someone might if they were just ripping a mainspring out of a barrel. But it prevents any sort of deformation to the mainspring because it comes up against a flat surface and then very quickly expands inside of this cavity. So you've got no risk of the barrel flying off on you. You've got no risk of the tail of the mainspring flipping around and cutting you in the face or in the arm. It just contains all of that energy in just a very elegant, simple solution that I really appreciate having. And I do tend to use the winder quite a bit just because it's there. It's easy to use. But I wouldn't say it's my favorite style of mainspring winder, but it's effective and does the job.
Now, I know with mainspring winders, they tend to be sized for different sort of different scales of watches. Is this geared, I guess, towards wristwatches? Is it compatible with doing work on pocket watches as well, which typically have much larger mainsprings?
ZF 2000 out of the box is specifically for high grade wristwatches. So it actually has various caliber numbers that it is very precisely dialed in for. I have another steel plate that I've customized to accommodate other barrel sizes that I may need. So I can take the tool apart and swap in a different plate and use it with larger pocket watches, and everything is adjustable, apart from those fixed diameter holes that you would drop a barrel into. And while on the topic of barrels, another thing that I find super handy when working with barrels is just a small can of compressed air, or if you happen to have a hose with compressed air wired up to your bench, you can make a little 3D print a little tip that you can do the same sort of thing with. But to open a barrel, if you were to just push down on the barrel arbor, which has kind of been the tradition for centuries now, rather than do that, you just put the nozzle of a source of compressed air up against the barrel and give it a little shot, and the barrel cover just pops right off. So one caveat with using the can of compressed air that I would say is not to do it if you don't intend to be cleaning the barrel very soon after. So if you are in the midst of assembling a watch and realize you need to take the barrel back apart again, just be mindful of the fact that the air that's coming out of these things is going through an endothermic chemical reaction. So it's actually rapidly cooling down everything that's coming into contact with. So you can end up getting some condensation occurring on the mainspring, which is something you don't really want to have happening. So I do this for my preliminary cleaning of the watch. This is how I'll open the barrel. And if I need to do it later during the assembly stage, if I detect a problem with the barrel, which is rare, I will then use the old school method of just very lightly pressing down. You might get a little bit of deformation in the lid of the barrel, but then you can readjust for that. Because I adjust for the unshake of the barrel every time I service a barrel anyway, so I always check for that. So it is possible to reverse that slight deformation, but it's always better to not have it introduced in the first place. So I do prefer using the compressed air technique for that. And then for closing barrels, I really like using a little acrylic barrel closer. I believe it was developed initially by Rolex, but you can get generic ones now. I've even got a couple 3D printable ones that I had up on Shapeways. And that's just really great for being able to close and make those minor modifications to the curvature of a barrel cover as well. But if you don't happen to have something like that kicking around, 2 pieces of wood with holes cut into them will do the exact same job as far as closing the barrel goes.
Most of the things I've talked about up until now have been primarily for the machining part of what I do. I tend to do a lot of machining work, mostly building tools for the jewelry work that I do. On the jewelry side of things, I would say my favorite tool in the jewelry world has to be my New Concepts jeweler saw. Now, for those of you who've been in a jeweler's shop before or been at a jeweler's bench, you'll know sort of the standard C-frame jeweler's saw that's been around for a few hundred years. They're everywhere. And the way that they typically work, if you're coming from a woodworking background, or if you've done any woodworking, it's similar to a coping saw. But they tend to use as jewelers, we tend to use very, very fine jeweler's blades or saw blades in these saws. And the typical frame, which is sort of a C shape, you push one end up against the bench and then put the handle up against your chest, and then you sort of lean into it and compress the frame. and then you put this fine blade in, and then you release it, and it puts the blade under tension. And that's the way that people have been using jeweler saws for, as I said, a few hundred years. A gentleman by the name of Lee Marshall, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year, he was a brilliant tool designer. In fact, we talked about Bonnie Doon Engineering last week with Phil Poirier. Lee was the one who originally started Bonnie Doon Engineering and then handed it over to Phil when he wanted to retire. But the retirement didn't stick quite as well as he thought it was going to. And he ended up starting New Concepts, which was a chance for him to build some new jewelry tools. So he developed the New Concepts jeweler saw. The saw is great. It's made out of aluminum. I think they do make a titanium version as well if you need an ultralight version. But most of them are made out of aluminum. And they're bright red. So you'll see photos of people's benches and you'll see these bright red jeweler saws on them. And the way that he's designed them, they're cut out to lighten up the saw a little bit, but also to strengthen them. And they're very, very rigid, which is wonderful because the bane of your existence if you're using a jeweler saw is a flexible frame. Once the frame starts to flex, you tend to snap your saw blades. And as I said, these saw blades are very thin, and you'll, especially when you first start out, you'll start breaking dozens and dozens of these blades. And the stiffer your saw frame is, the better it's going to be for the blade. The longer the blade's going to last, the more accurate your sawing is going to be. And so these frames are very, very stiff. They're nice to work with. On top of that, he's created this quick release mechanism so that you can consistently put the same amount of force on your saw blade. In my case, I tend to use 3 different sizes of saw blades on a regular basis. I use a 3/0 saw blade, a 4/0 saw blade, and a 5/0 saw blade. And that's from large to small. So the 3/0 is the largest, and then the 5/0 is the smallest. Because they're thinner blades, as you get down into a finer blade, they require a different amount of tension. If I put the same amount of tension on my 5/0 blade as I do on my 3/0 blade, the blade would just snap. It would just explode. And so I have 3 different jeweler saws that are set up for each type of saw blade with this quick release mechanism that Lee developed for the jeweler saw, for this New Concept saw. It allows you to dial in that tension so that it's just right, and you can repeat it every single time you put a new blade into the saw frame, which saves you so much time and hassle. These things look a little bit funky. As I said, they're bright red, and they've got the frame is cut out, but they are light. They're comfortable to work with. They're rigid, and they're very repeatable, and they are worth every single penny you'll pay for them. So they're certainly worthwhile using. If you're getting into making jewelry, buy yourself one of these. Buy yourself good quality saw blades. Don't get cheap saw blades. It's a false economy. It's just not worth doing. Between good quality saw blades and one of these saws, it will make your life so much easier. Sawing will go from being something that you dread to something that you can do quickly and accurately, and will certainly improve the quality of your work quickly just because you're working with a good quality tool that's doing the job properly.
They're great beyond just jewelry work as well. My brother's a fine carpenter, and he swears by the New Concepts saws as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know Lee sells a lot of those, or I should say New Concepts now sell a lot of those to woodworkers, and they're now replacing sort of the traditional coping saw, because you can put the larger saw blades into them. You can put the heavier duty saw blades for doing woodworking into them. So absolutely, if you're doing any type of fine saw work, whether a coping saw or a jeweler saw is what you would have been using, get yourself one of these. It will pay for itself just in the number of blades you break in a year. It's totally worth it.
In cutting on an entirely different scale, another red tool that I really like is my set of ruby files. So I've got just a very small set of files that are made of pure ruby. They have a very mild abrasive surface on them compared to typical steel file. Just a really great pre-finish before doing final polishing or just needing to take a surface down by just the fractions of a millimeter before burnishing a pivot, or just making sure you've got that nice even surface. I find them really, really handy. They are fragile, being a crystalline structure. I've only ever snapped one in all of my years using them, but that is a caveat there as well. But the finish that they provide prior to doing a final burnishing or a final polish is fantastic. And in a similar vein to another pre-finishing item that I really find a lot of value in are artifacts wheels. So for working on cases or bracelets, they just do a really good pre-finish treatment. They'll take out nicks and scratches, and I find they don't eat away at a metal surface the way a lot of other products might when you're trying to do this sort of work. It's almost like it burnishes the steel. Can get versions that work with gold as well, but it just sort of massages the metal into a nice consistent surface that's just great for then running across a felt wheel and then a final polish on a cotton wheel. I would highly recommend Artifacts wheels. They're really great. And then of course, after having done some polishing work and whatnot, it's really important that my hands stay nice and clean. So even a product like, say, Fast Orange that you might find in a mechanic shop or getting caked on dirt off doesn't get down into the really fine cracks in your fingers or like down in your fingerprints or what have you. So a product that I swear by, just a soft nail brush. It's also known as a surgeon's nail brush or a sensory brush. It's just this very fine plastic brush, and it is, as the name implies, incredibly soft, but incredibly effective at getting down in and cleaning any sort of dirt off your hands. Love having them around the shop, keep them kicking around the house too after doing a little bit of work on the car or even painting. Absolutely fantastic for getting really surgically clean hands, so to speak.
I also use a lot of nitrile gloves in the shop to avoid needing to clean my hands as often. When I'm working on jewelry and watches, I don't wear them because I need to be able to feel what's going on, and the nitrile gloves just take away that touch when I'm working. Although I do use just the little fingertip cots or whatever for when I'm doing some watch work, but I don't tend to wear complete nitrile gloves when I'm doing the really delicate stuff. But certainly when I'm doing machining work or anything dirty, I tend to wear nitrile gloves just to prevent the number of times or reduce the number of times that I have to wash my hands. I find my hands get destroyed by cleaners. I try to avoid washing them as much as possible. And certainly when you're doing a lot of machining work, they just get filthy with oils and everything else that you're working with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Nitrile gloves are out of the question. We're working on a polishing lathe. I use little leather finger cots for that sort of thing, but unfortunately that doesn't give your hands enough coverage to keep from getting a polishing compound on your hands.
There are two things that I carry with me in the shop all the time. One is a little pocket flashlight. I don't tend to carry this around when I'm not in the shop, but while I'm in the shop, I carry this around quite a bit. And I use a high-intensity light from Nightcore. The thing I love about it is that it has several different intensity modes. So you can go from 1 lumen to 10 lumens to 100 lumens to 1,000 lumens. I find that very useful when I'm in the shop because depending on how dark it is, how bright it is, what it is I'm looking for, I can easily adjust the amount of light, the intensity of light that's coming out of it. And it's bright enough that even, I live out in the country, so even in the pitch black at night, it's bright enough that I can easily see, 100 meters away. And it's great for being outdoors in pitch black if I need to see something. But I can also turn it down and use it in if it is dark and I don't want to destroy my night vision and I just need to find my way around or whatever, then it's very handy for that. So having a good quality flashlight, an LED flashlight, this one is I find it indispensable. I use it quite a bit.
I had a Nightcore as well, but actually ended up giving it up because I wasn't a fan of the way that the button on my particular Nightcore operated. Then I found it was often accidentally turned on, and that high of a lumen count, depending on what mode it was in, it would very quickly deplete the battery. So I stopped carrying my Nightcore, I had the EA4, which was one of their 860 lumen models. Do you happen to know offhand what model of flashlight your Nightcore is?
This particular one is the P12 GT. I don't mind the button on the back of it. It is slightly recessed. I don't mind where it's located. It is protected a little bit, but it's still relatively easy to turn on and off. And it has another mode switch towards the front of it that is in a convenient spot when you're holding it in your hand and your thumb sort of sits on top of it. Sometimes it can be a bit difficult to feel where it is. If you don't have gloves on or whatever, it's easy because it's rubber versus the rest of the aluminum body of the flashlight. And that mode button allows you to switch between the different lumen modes and a few other things like SOS mode and whatnot. But I find that this one tends to be good. When I'm not in the shop, this tends to stay in my briefcase, and it has come in handy a few times when I've been out and around and I've needed it. For the most part, I've been reasonably pleased with it. It's a bit large to carry around in your pocket all the time, though, so it tends to be a shop only thing when I'm actually just carrying it around.
That's another reason that I made this switch that I did as well, is that I found it a bit on the bulky side. My everyday carry as far as flashlights go is the Super Beam Q1, which I've actually noticed kicking around your watchmaking Lair, and I find that to just be a nice balance for me between the size and the output and the reliability of it. I also appreciate that you can very quickly and easily focus the beam. So if I happen to have a part fall from my bench, just turn the lights out, drop down to the floor, and just leave the flashlight on its side on the floor, and you just do a quick sweep. All of a sudden, a really tiny component that you could barely make out will cast this really long shadow. That'll be 10 or 20 times the size of the object itself. And it just makes it very quick to pinpoint where a particular part is landed. So I'm happy with that. It's nowhere near as powerful as the Nightcore, but I believe it cranks at about 120 lumens, which is sufficient for my purposes with it. It certainly doesn't hold a candle to the Nightcore when I'm out camping in the woods or something like that.
Right. I've, as you say, I do have one sitting on my watchmaker's bench, and it is handy for that kind of thing, trying to find parts on the floor. I just don't find it bright enough. Again, because I'm living out in the country, when I'm outside and it's black, especially at this time of year, you'll be working in the shop and you're working until 6 o'clock at night or whatever, and you turn off the shop lights and you realize that not only is it nighttime, but you're out in the middle of nowhere with no moonlight and no street lights, and it is pitch black out here. Not black enough that you can't see your hand in front of your face sometimes. So it's I find that the smaller lights tend to be a little bit too dim sometimes when I'm just sort of moving around, or especially if I'm outside and I need to be able to see something, maybe fallen trees or damage to the house or whatever. I find that it just doesn't tend to be bright enough. But certainly the smaller, lower intensity lights can be extremely useful, especially as inspection lights. Again, that's the other reason why I do like the Nightcore, is because you can change the intensity on them. So if I'm doing inspection, if I'm sort of looking inside of a machine or something like that, you don't need 1,000 lumens, or sometimes you don't even need 100 lumens blasting at the inside of something. So it's nice sometimes just to have a lower intensity light, but definitely a good quality LED flashlight is worth its weight in gold if you're trying to find that tiny little part that's on the floor. Now, the thing that I do carry with me just about everywhere, even outside of the shop, is a good quality pocket knife. I know a lot of people these days have gotten out of the habit of carrying pocket knives, and these days the only place that I don't carry one around is typically on an airplane, obviously, and that drives me nuts not having a knife around. I find it invaluable to have a good quality pocket knife that I can use for doing everything from shaving something off of a part, to cutting things open, cutting open packaging, whatever it happens to be. And one of the things I've found over the years is having a quality pocket knife that you can open with one hand is important. Oftentimes I have something in one hand and need to grab a knife to be able to open it, or whatever it happens to be. So having a knife that I can open easily with one hand is great. The one that I tend to carry with me is a Benchmade 670 pocket knife. Unfortunately, this particular model isn't made anymore, but there's a couple of other good quality ones out there that we'll link to. And I'm a huge fan of the Benchmade knives. They're well made. They're reasonably priced. They have excellent quality steel in the blades, so you can easily sharpen them back up to a razor sharp edge. And having a good quality knife in your pocket is something that's extremely useful, and you'll quickly realize how often you're reaching for a knife or you need a knife when you've got one at hand and you can actually grab it easily, and again open it with one hand easily and lock it in place.
In terms of pocket knives, there is a knife I like using around the shop. That's just a case back knife for opening up snapback watch cases. And the particular one I use is actually Omega branded, but it's made by Victorinox, and they are available from other watch companies as well. As I really appreciate the build quality of the blade, as well as the ergonomics of the handle in the hand. Because I find a lot of bench knives have very slender handles, and it's just not ergonomic and doesn't give you the leverage that you need on really clamped down snapback cases.
Of course, being a pen guy, I do tend to use a pen a lot in the shop, and I tend to use my own pens in the shop. That's one of the ways that I sort of do prototype testing with my pens, is that if they can survive several months in the shop with me, then they're pretty good. But a pencil is my preferred writing instrument in the shop, especially when I'm taking quick notes or if I'm doing quick drawings or whatever. I tend to use a pencil quite a bit. The pencils that I've been using a lot lately are the Blackwing pencils. If I remember correctly, this is a reboot of an older pencil brand, and the graphite in these pencils is wonderful. It leaves a nice color, a nice tone on the page. They tend to be a really, really wonderful pencil to write with, and they're not the cheap, Ticonderoga yellow, HB pencils that you remember as a kid. These are really good quality. I've lost a few of them to my wife now. She's a calligrapher and she's stolen a few of them for her studio. But they're certainly worthwhile looking at. If you want a good quality pencil, the Blackwing pencil is excellent. And then to go with that, a good quality notebook is also important. I journal about my day in the shop at the end of the day, and I tend to write down a little bit about what I was working on and the problems that I've been having. If I'm trying to figure out how to work through a problem or whatever, I'll write them down in a notebook, and I'll do sketches and things like that in there. And I find that it's an important record of what it is that I'm doing and when it is that I'm doing. Sometimes it's worthwhile being able to look back and see ideas that you had years ago, or even be able to look back at some of the problems you've been having, and you may have new ideas for how to solve them. Now, in my case, I've gone through dozens and dozens of brands of notebooks. The brand that I'm using now that I absolutely love is a brand called Statology. I get them from Wonder Pens in Toronto. I'm a big fan of dealing with Wonder Pens. John and Liz, who run Wonder Pens, are great people. If you're ever in the area, I highly recommend you go in and visit the shop. It's a great little shop to wander around. And they also have an excellent service online for ordering online. And they started carrying these Statology notebooks a few years ago. It's a brand out of Japan. One of the things that I love about it is they have very, very thin paper in them, very fine paper. It's a Tomoe River paper, and if you're in the stationery world, you'll know the name Tomoe River. They make this beautiful thin paper that is remarkably durable. And the thing I love most about it is that you can use a pen on it. You can use a proper fountain pen on it, and it won't bleed through to the other side of the paper. So many cheap notebooks with low quality paper will bleed through quite easily. This is thin enough that you can get quite a few pages in a book without it being massively large. But the paper is durable, and it's also sturdy enough, it's well sized so that you don't have that bleed through of your notes onto the back side of it. Unlike a lot of daily journal books where they have a specific date on each page of the book, these have a little guide at the top with the months and the days. And so you can just circle, and the days of the week. And so you can just circle which month, day of the week, and date it is. So it's an easy way for you to fill every page. If you miss a couple of days, you don't have to worry about having pages that are specific to a particular date that you can't, you don't want to use now because they're dedicated to December 4th and you weren't actually writing anything on December 4th. Also, it means that if you need 3 or 4 pages for a particular day, you can use as many pages as you need to for that particular day, and you just note that that's the date that those pages go with. So it's a very easy way for you to reliably record which day it is that you're working on them, not be sort of forced to leave pages empty because they're specific to a date. And then I believe the one I've got, and I think all of them are like this, they have a grid pattern on them. So that makes it very easy if you're doing drawings or whatever it happens to be. The grid pattern is sort of nice to be able to, to work with and use for sketching and things like that, as well as to, keep your writing in a neat format. I highly recommend both. A good pencil, a good pen, of course, if you've got one. But a quality notebook is absolutely critical for regardless of what it is that you're writing with. And you'll find the paper, good quality paper, makes a big difference in a notebook. And these Statology notebooks are some of the best that I've found so far.
So the last thing I would mention is a good water bottle. So I find it's invaluable to stay well hydrated while working throughout the day. I appreciate having a water bottle that I find aesthetically pleasing. I really like the look of the Core 1 water bottle, which is the same water bottle that you may have spotted in the workshop of Tony Stark in the Iron Man films. And it's BPA free, but it's plastic. And I'm not the biggest fan of drinking out of plastic. So if there was a glass version of that bottle, I would be all over it. I've found I've gravitated to over the years is actually just reusing Voss water bottles. So Voss is an artisanal water from Norway. I just happened to pick one up a while back and was using that for a long time and decided I wanted to have some backups that I could cycle through and buy them at regular price. You'd be looking at a couple dollars for a bottle. But really, in the grand scheme of things, it's not much to shell out at all for a water bottle. It's just a nice smooth cylinder of water that sits there on my bench and keeps me hydrated through the day.
I don't drink nearly enough when I'm in the shop, and of course sometimes I have to be careful about drinking in the shop just because I've got dangerous things around. But if I'm not working on dangerous things, I tend not to drink enough, and that's a bad thing. So definitely worthwhile having a good water bottle in the shop.
Yeah, you almost need a Camelback, hermetically sealed, and just lean over and take a drink.
I do happen to have one of those around, but that might be a little uncomfortable walking around the shop with a Camelback on all the time.
Yeah, and walking around your shop with a backpack on is probably not the brightest idea. You don't want to be knocking anything over.
Yeah, so John is making fun of me because my shop is very tightly packed with junk, and it's difficult to walk around sometimes, and it's something I'm working on trying to fix, but it is a bit of a challenge right now walking around my shop, and it's not safe for human habitation. Both of us have mentioned listening to audiobooks and podcasts while we're working, so obviously listening to a quality podcast like Off Hours is great while you're in the shop, and there's some great podcasts out there, but audiobooks tend to fill a lot of my days when I'm in the shop. So even though they're not a sponsor, I'm a huge fan of Audible, and I've had a subscription for years. I tend to listen to audiobooks quite a bit from there, and you can also often get audiobooks out of your local library as well. There's tools out there for borrowing them for free from your local library, so it's worthwhile, however you go about getting them, to look at audiobooks. They're a great way to pass the time in the shop, and also to, whether it's just for fun, you're listening to fiction, or whether you're listening to something a little bit more educational, then audiobooks are definitely a good way of filling your time.
So you have a particular audiobook you'd recommend for the holiday season?
The book that I've just finished listening to that I've probably enjoyed more than any other in the last few years is a new book by Andy Weir. For those of you who trying to figure out where that name you might be placing that name, Andy Weir was the author of The Martian, which was a big movie a couple of years ago with Matt Damon in it. And his most recent book is called Artemis. It takes place on a moon colony, and probably the most enjoyable part of this book. The story is excellent, and the characters are fun, and the dialogue is good. But probably the most enjoyable part of this audiobook is that it was read by Rosario Dawson, who really brought life to the character and was just a joy to listen to. As I said, I listen to a lot of audiobooks. Sometimes the narrators can be a little bit stuffy, and listening to Rosario read this book was a total joy. I highly recommend this book, even if you're not into science fiction normally. It's a lot of fun, and she really brings a lot of life to the book. It's certainly worth listening to. How about you? Do you have a favorite book that you've read recently that you enjoy?
Yeah, it's not often that I listen to fiction, but it is a nice break every now and then. And actually, coincidentally, when I first heard the title of Andy Weir's new book, Artemis, I immediately thought of another book, Ready Player One, in which there's a key character named Artemis. And when I read Ready Player One, I thought that her storyline would actually make for a great sequel. So I had actually thought at the time that I first heard about Weir's new novel that it had actually been written by Ernie Klein and was a sequel to Ready Player One, or whatever you might call a parallel story. So not really a sequel or a prequel, but something that's happening at the same time. Because I really enjoyed listening to Ready Player One. It was just a really entertaining listen. It's narrated by Will Wheaton, which actually adds an extra element of charm as he makes a cameo appearance in the novel at some point. And I found Ready Player One to be a really unique subgenre in that it combines dystopian and cyberpunk fiction with escapism and real life pop culture nostalgia in an all too plausible future. My only real complaint that I would have had against the book when I'd first read it was that the protagonist was a Caucasian male, which is why I had been excited that perhaps Artemis was taking the lead in another book. But that's not the case. And Artemis, as you have mentioned, turns out to be a great book in its own right. Does it have any sort of relation to The Martian at all? Do you know?
No, it doesn't have any relation. It's not in the same world. It takes place in a sort of a future universe. I don't remember how far in the future, but it does take place in the future, and it takes place on a moon colony, and the primary character is a woman who's on Artemis. You're following along her sort of her tale over a short period of time, and it is sort of amusing the way that he deals with things like the original landing site for the Apollo 11 moon landing, and that, because of course it's been turned into a sort of a national park on the moon. So there's a few entertaining things, a few call outs to actual science and space history if you're a bit of a space history geek. So that's worthwhile. But it's a really enjoyable tale, and even, as I said, even if you're not into science fiction, this isn't hardcore science fiction. And I think most people could, if you enjoy a good story and you enjoy good characters, I think you'll enjoy listening to this.
I'd say the same thing for Ready Player One. It's set somewhere in the not too distant future in America, and is very much a virtual reality story. Elements of the real world woven in as well. But yeah, just a really entertaining read. Nice little break for the holidays, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah, I did enjoy reading Ready Player One a number of years ago when it first came out, and also I believe Steven Spielberg is doing a movie of it. I think it's coming out next year sometime. So if you're one of those people who likes to read the book before seeing the movie or read the book instead of the movie, then next year this is coming out as a movie, so it might be worthwhile reading it before you see the movie. And then the last thing that I think we want to talk about, and this is something that we both agree on is worthwhile, and this is great if you've got a budding watchmaker in the house or someone you're buying for as a watchmaker or is interested in watchmaking. And I know we've mentioned this a number of times before, and I think it's made an appearance on nearly every one of our episodes so far. And that's Watchmaking by George Daniels. This is the book to get at this point if you are interested in watchmaking. You want to learn about the process and see how a master watchmaker approaches designing and making his particular watches. I think there's a few downsides to the way that he handles some of the material, because he is focused a lot on making his pocket watches. But regardless of that, I don't think there's a better book out there for learning watchmaking and sort of a holistic approach like that. He covers nearly every aspect of watchmaking and actually building a watch from scratch. And I think that makes it worthwhile. And certainly if you know someone who's interested in watchmaking, this is worthwhile getting for them, and they will enjoy reading it.
Mm-hmm. And it's definitely worth picking up now while it's still in print, because the last time it went out of print, the prices quickly escalated into the mid three figures, and some copies were even going in the 4-figure range. Right now, while it's still at publisher's price, or maybe you can pick it up for even less, definitely recommend picking up a copy.
Absolutely. I have the second edition and the third edition, and I do remember when the second edition was starting to go up to ridiculous prices, and I was happy to see the third edition come out and that it's a little bit more reasonable in price again. Hopefully the Daniels estate will continue to keep it in circulation and in print, because it is really the only thing out there right now that's equivalent. There certainly are a couple of other good books out there. Some schools have put out good material and whatnot, but I don't think there's anything that really matches this. Plus, it has a few interesting stories in it from Daniels himself, and a little bit of the personality and charm of him in there as well, in terms of how and why he designed things the way that he did.
Thanks for listening to Off Hours. You can find detailed show notes at offhours.show. If you'd like to keep up to date with the show, follow us on Twitter @offhours. John can be found on Twitter @UnderTheLoop, and Chris can be found on Twitter and Instagram @silver_hand.